In this video, we're rewiring the Vega, and yeah. Welcome to the Burnouts and Rotorblades YouTube channel. Let's go do something awesome. All aboard! So the Vega wagon, since I picked it up, has had no lights on the dash. Knob, it comes off. Headlights are on, but you know, no dash lights at all. The oil pressure gauge doesn't work. Okay, radio works-ish. I don't think that works. There's also some other gauges that don't work, and today's mission is to figure out why that is. Okay. There's some pretty hokey wiring going on. I mean, really? What? Seriously? There's no... There's... All the wiring is done like this. Everything back here is done with just electrical tape, and sometimes not even that. Oh, wow. It's got a tape deck in it. By the way, I don't quite understand what most of this crap goes to, and there's just a lot of red wires that are seem to end up over here with this whatever fader from the 80s probably, and there's like this thing and all that. So we'll have to sort through that and figure out, you know, where the disconnect is, literally. To help us today, I have my favorite electrical tool, the power probe. Sorry for the fan noise, but it is like 112 degrees here in Vegas, and yeah, I'm gonna keep the fan on. It has a little circuit breaker on the side, so if you screw up, it'll just pop the circuit breaker. It gives a light. It does everything that a test light will do. It'll tell you how much voltage you're receiving. You can apply a ground, or you can apply power, and if you want to check a specific ground, you can put the ground on here to check a specific loop. But the other ends of it get attached directly to the battery, and it's got about 10 feet of reach, so there's really nothing you can't reach unless you're working on like a motorhome. I'm doing some wiring on the back of this cluster, and everything looks pretty good on it. Here's the front of it. It's got a tachometer, and then there's this thing right here, which is a Stewart Warner mechanical oil pressure gauge that doesn't belong here, and somebody retrofitted in. I didn't even notice it until I was pretty deep into it. So I hate mechanical oil pressure gauges. These gauges have been in the car for I don't know how long, and honestly, like, the prospect of that happening while I'm driving with, you know, 40 to 80 psi 200 degree oil right above my legs is not appealing at all. So that is why I hate these kind of gauges. And I will remove them if given the choice. We're gonna go ahead and change those out with one of these Equus gauges in a 1.5 inch, which looks like it'll fit. The oil pressure gauge is running a little behind, so right now we'll just do the water temp and the amp gauge. The idea behind installing these little 1.5 inch gauges is so that we can take the stock bezel panel, slide it over the top for that stock gauge look. This one over here should be fine, but I can take and open this one up just a little bit more so I can see the rest of the gauge, but it's not even really necessary because 160 to 240 really gives me a pretty good indication of where I'm at health-wise with the engine. So I'm about to install this oil pressure sender that came with our gauges that we retrofitted into the gauge cluster. I want to take a second to talk about how I'm going to do that and what tools and supplies I'm going to use. The tools and supplies are going to be wire cutters and crimpers, strippers, Heat shrink. The heat shrink that I'm going to use, heat shrink tube, is a 4-to-1 tube. That's what separates your good from your bad heat shrink. Most of the heat shrink you're going to find at like Harbor Freight and your parts stores are going to be 2-to-1, which means it'll shrink half the size. 4-to-1, a quarter the size. I'm going to use heat shrink ring connector. I use all heat shrink connectors when I use crimp connectors in the engine bay, just for water, you know, just I don't want problems later on. I'm going to use some 16 or 18 gauge wire. I'm not endorsed by any of this stuff, but this came from Summit. I use this stuff in aviation pretty regularly, and it's a woven fabric wrap, and it replaces the old school convoluted ducting, and I like it quite a bit. Something else we're going to use is this self-adhesive tape for the ends, but in this instance I'm going to use the heat shrink because it's small enough. We'll take our wire here, we'll put it in the 18 gauge slot, give her a little twist. Let's not do this rookie mistake. Put our heat shrink tube on first. Now we'll grab our crimpers. And you want to go until you see a little bit of that glue stick out of the end. I'm going to cut a length of our woven wire cover here. Now this stuff is pretty easy to use. It just spreads open like that, and you can lay your wire down inside of it, and then it covers over the wire. We're going to cheat for right now, and I'm just going to throw this into. We're going to take this piece here, heat it up with our lighter. Now that's a nice looking piece that we can drop into our engine bay. It says in the instructions for these, do not put Teflon tape around them. You got to remember that your gauge is basically just an electronic resistance reading tool, and that it has to get a good ground through the threads for most of them, for this one specifically. So hopefully this fits down there. If not, we'll have to get an extension. Alright, since it doesn't fit, I happen to just have one of these laying around. It's a 90-degree fitting, so we'll go ahead and use that. Now that we have this sensor line installed, let's go ahead and add it to the already existing wire loom, which is really a pretty simple thing to do. We're going to add it to this larger loom. We take some of this self-adhesive tape and give it a little wrap around. It's nice to give it a little stretch as you do so. Holds it nice and tight. And this tape only sticks to itself, so it's not sticky. It'll just hold it there in place. And while we're doing this one right here for the oil pressure sender, we're also going to do this one here for the water temp sender. We're going to take both of those and add them to this. Now we got this loom kind of where we want it. We can add some more self-adhesive tape. That's a nice neat little T-junction there. Now we can keep on going with these. I have a nice tidy little loom that won't get in the way and looks great. Off camera, I added a second fuse block piggybacked off the stock fuse block. I also added some wires and coiled them up out of the way so that I could add other circuits as required at a future date. For the new gauges that I added into the dash, I went ahead and added this weather pack connector and wired it up to the stock fuse panel and all of our gauge senders that we just finished installing. We wrapped up all the wires under the dash that were required after I got done sorting through the spaghetti loom that was left by the previous owner into the snakeskin, and then went ahead and tucked it up nice and neat up underneath the dash. It looks really nice now, and we went ahead and carried that treatment forward out into the engine bay. Now before we go ahead and reinstall the dash completely, there's a few items we need to take care of with regard to the instrument panel. A, we need to tidy up the back of that as well and make it look as good as everywhere else in the car. Next, I wanted to try out a little idea I had to make the old gauge lights in this bezel a little brighter, and that's to spray paint some chrome spray paint on the back of the gauge bezel cover to reflect the light a little bit better. And after a couple of weeks of driving around with this, I can attest that it works really well. Let's throw this thing back together so we can get a good look at it. don't forget to subscribe if you like the content and want to see more like it. And as always, thanks for watching.
What are you doing?
Breaking stuff. What are you doing?
Why are you breaking stuff?
Just to make monkeys ask questions.
No, for real! Why are you laughing at me like a jackhammer?
Jackhammer?
Stop laughing at me like Jack Silly Hammer.
A Jack Silly Hammer.